Hello everyone, welcome back to What the Horror. I hope you're doing really well. But if you're new here and you like movies and you like horror, don't forget to click that subscribe button as I am here for you with movie reviews, rankings, comparisons and deep dives. In today's episode, we are talking about Edgar Wright's new film, Last Night in Soho, released earlier this year in October. I will be including spoilers in this review, so as always, if you haven't seen the film, I would recommend you go and watch it first and then come back to the episode. An aspiring fashion designer is mysteriously able to enter the 1960s, where she encounters a dazzling wannabe singer. However, the glamour is not all it appears to be, and the dreams of the past start to crack and splinter into something far darker. Last Night in Soho is the latest film from British director Edgar Wright. It stars Anya Taylor-Joy, Thomasin McKenzie, Matt Smith and the late Diana Rigg. It was originally due for release in September 2020, but due to world events, they didn't finish filming until December 2020 and then finally released it in October 2021. It feels as though Last Night in Soho did fall on the right side of delayed though. I mean, unlike films like Antlers and No Time to Die, Wonder Woman 84 and the latest Ghostbusters, it feels like we've been waiting for those films forever. But Last Night in Soho dropped its trailer and we didn't have long to wait until we actually had the film released itself. Hey guys, just me popping in from the future. I realised that I forgot to talk about some things that I wanted to talk about, so I'm adding them in here. I don't know if I'm going to slice them in through the episode or just lump them in somewhere, but apologies for this. But in the meantime, back to past Sarah. So like one of the movie's leading ladies, Edgar Wright himself has always been obsessed with the 1960s and discovered a love for the music of that decade through his family's record collection when he was younger. He describes Last Night in Soho as a personal film for him. He explains that there are elements of Eloise that are very similar to his experience. He's referencing that doe-eyed, puppy dog enthusiasm when talking to someone about the 1960s, and especially when talking to someone about the 1960s who actually lived through that decade. Wright says that Last Night in Soho is actually a cautionary tale against nostalgia. We often look back at the past and certain decades through rose-tinted glasses, thinking of them as the good old days, and we romanticize them through the music and the fashion and the movies of that decade, and forgetting that as with modern day, there is always a darker side to things. I'm personally definitely guilty of doing this. I identified with Eloise in numerous ways in the first half of the film. I grew up loving vintage interiors and the music of the 60s and 70s and the fashion of the 40s and 60s and movies from classic Hollywood idolising people like Grace Kelly, Marilyn Monroe and Steve McQueen. I loved that Last Night in Soho, it seems to celebrate people being original and different whilst also showing that just as in the past, in modern day, it is still quite difficult to be so. Eloise is met with taunting and ridicule by her peers because of her love of the 60s and the way it influences the music she listens to and the way that she dresses. And Sandy is a free-spirited, independent woman in a time when it was still a male-dominated world, and she is ultimately dominated by the men in her own life. But I think despite that, despite the difficulties, I think the film is still saying, be true to yourself. As always with Edgar Wright films, the soundtrack is one of the strongest aspects of the film, and these are not just random songs thrown in there because they're from the 60s. They are a list of songs that were carefully curated by Wright himself to play as the perfect accompaniment to the characters and the setting and the atmosphere of the film. Each one is carefully chosen for a real purpose. So for example, you have Starstruck by the Kinks, which references both Sandy and Eloise, who are young women who came to the city of London and were starstruck by the power of its possibilities. And you have the heartbreaking lyrics of Cilla Black's Anyone Who Had a Heart. You also have the song Puppet on a String by Sandy Shaw, whose lyrics are completely on the nose for the scene they're used in. It's the scene where Sandy is dancing, she's a backing dancer in a club for a woman who is dressed as a marionette doll, And it's obviously referencing that the audience is just full of men. It's the men who are pulling the strings of the women, who are just puppets in this situation. Anna Taylor-Joy actually recorded a couple of versions of Petula Clark's Downtown. She did an up-tempo version, which is to reflect the hustle and energy of the time, and then she also did a haunting a cappella version which evokes the ghosts of the past. In interviews that I read, Edgar Wright describes Soho as the epicenter of the swinging 60s through film and fashion and music. And in Last Night in Soho, he actually makes the setting of Soho one of the main characters, just as important as Sandy or Eloise. There is a lot attributed to the ghosts of the past and poignant memories in Last Night in Soho. And while in the film, Eloise's gift allows her to see the literal ghosts of the past, Edgar Wright believes that the streets and the old buildings themselves are occupied by the ghosts of memories and of times long since gone. I read this article with Edgar Wright where he's talking about the images of Soho that he includes, that he slices into the credits at the end of the film. And basically what had happened was he had geared himself up to go for a walk through Soho during recent world events, and found that the image of Soho's streets, so quiet and so abandoned, was really quite an eerie image. So he decided to go back with his film crew so that they could capture footage of the abandoned and deserted streets of Soho. And he said that he thought this added a level of poignancy to the film, because not only is it footage of these streets that have previously been so filled with activity and memories and ghosts of past times, but now this footage itself is a ghost memory of the past. You know, we have progressed through recent world events. We are now no longer at that stage. And so what he has captured is an image of a time since gone. He also mentions as well that sadly they have since lost two of the actresses that were in the film, most notably Diana Rigg, who he describes as an iconic image of the 60s, quite rightly so, I think, or at least definitely of British 60s. I mean, not only did she play the fabulous Emma Peel in the TV series The Avengers, but she was also a Bond girl in the film On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So again, he mentions just all these events adding another level of poignancy to Last Night in Soho. One of the most, if not the most iconic scene of the film is the one at Café de Paris, which acts as the backdrop for our introduction to Sandy and Jack. Eloise, on her first night in the bedsit, drops into a dream where she's pulled back into the past, into Soho in the 1960s. But as she enters the Café de Paris, it becomes evident that she's not the participant in these events, but rather she is the observer of Sandy. We watch and observe along with Eloise as Sandy floats through the room in their striking pink chiffon dress. She has a determination to become a singer, to become a star, and this is where she meets the handsome Jack, who is kind and chivalrous, and it appears that she has begun on the track to stardom. This scene in the film perfectly encapsulates the idea of nostalgia and viewing things through rose-tinted glasses. Both Eloise and the audience are introduced to Soho in the swinging 60s through this scene, through images of shining lights, glamorous people, Cilla Black singing, classy bars where people drink martinis, and the striking image of Eloise and Jack dancing. This is the 60s that Eloise pictures, and what she does with the 60s, she does with Sandy as well. She instantly becomes captivated by her and views her through this dreamlike state, like she does with the 60s. But of course, as the film goes on, the shine of the rose-tinted glasses fades away as Eloise and the audience begin to see the reality of Soho and of Sandy's situation. The exterior shots of Café de Paris were filmed in the Haymarket in London, and they used period cars and extras, while the interior shots were all filmed in an exact replica that they made for the film. Wright explained that it would have been very problematic to film certain scenes within the real Café de Paris, and in the end much more costly as well. The scene has a heavy use of mirrors to show Eloise observing Sandy, and they achieved this through a lot of clever film trickery. As Eloise enters the lobby of the cafe, she observes her reflection in a mirror, which then turns into Sandy. And the way that they achieved this was they created an empty frame rather than using a mirror. And as in the Marx Brothers Duck Soup, the actresses had to mimic each other's movements perfectly. They also cast the Phelps twins, who played Fred and George Weasley in the Harry Potter films, as the maitre d', so they could have one of them on each side of the frame. And the scene where Sandy dances with Jack was actually a very cleverly choreographed dance scene where all three of the actors were dancing together, and Wright would position the Steadicam so that Anya Taylor-Joy and Thomasin McKenzie could drop out of shot and swap and change. The Café de Paris scene is definitely my favourite of the film. I mean, it's initially an unexplained shift in the movie, but it's done so well that in the end it just doesn't really matter. Last Night in Soho sees Edgar Wright go in a different direction with his editing choices. Don't get me wrong, it still feels like one of his films. It definitely still has that slick, tight style to it. I mean, in Edgar Wright films, there is always a reason behind every shot, every song, every choice. Every frame is purposefully filled and shot and edited. But in Last Night in Soho, there are no longer those kinetic multi-shot scenes that we've seen in films like Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, scenes where he can make the most mundane everyday situation seem really exciting, whether it's a commute to somewhere or whether it's getting ready for the workday. And there's also not the usual dialogue foreshadowing from a character or the literal clues on building walls and things like that, like there have been in Shaun of the Dead and Baby Driver. One thing I did notice that Wright does in this film that he has done in previous films is he choreographs his characters' movements to perfectly match the beats of a song that's playing. So for example, he's previously done this in Shaun of the Dead when the group is in the Winchester pub and they're attacking a zombie with pool cues. That fight scene is perfectly choreographed so that every time they hit it, it's matching the beats of the Queen song Don't Stop Me Now. And in Last Night in Soho, Eloise walks down the steps of her bedsit, perfectly matching the beat of the song I've Got My Mind Set on You. And while there may not be literal clues on building walls or foreshadowing dialogue from a character, there are still lots of clues within Last Night in Soho to the reveal that Miss Collins is Sandy and that she killed all of those men. So for example, when Miss Collins first shows Eloise the bedsit, she tells her that in the summertime she should plug the drains because the smells begin to rise, and I wondered, is that the smell of the dead bodies? And when Miss Collins finds out that John is in Eloise's room, one of the first things she says to her is, "Did he hurt you?" When Jack asks Sandy what Sandy is short for, she says Alexandra, and we discover that Miss Collins' first name is Alexandra. And as for the fate of the men, when Eloise is looking through the newspapers to find an article about a missing woman, she doesn't find one. But as she's scrolling through, there are plenty of articles about missing men. And even though I read these articles, I didn't make the connection, I didn't pick up on it initially. But then once you know the reveal, I did remember that we had seen these articles. And also not forgetting that Eloise's gift in the film is that she can see spirits. So when she's being haunted by these men who attacked Sandy, she's actually seeing their ghosts. And again, I didn't initially pick up on this. So as much as I have gushed about this film, there is one negative aspect of it for me. And upon reading reviews, it does seem to be a make or break aspect for other people as well. And that is the decision to make Sandy a villain by the end of the film. Now, Sandy, as we observe through the film, is very clearly a victim of the times, a victim of the dominant men in her life who then go on to use and abuse her. When Sandy first meets Jack, he seems very taken with her and very supportive of her dream to be a star. But as it transpires, he's only interested insofar as what he can personally take from her, and then what he can gain from her in other ways later on. We see that through Jack's organising, she is repeatedly assaulted by men for money and led to believe that Jack kills her. But the twist in the end is that Sandy in fact killed Jack and all of the men who hurt her. There have certainly been plenty of films that have dealt with this subject matter, and especially in horror, there seems to be a whole subgenre that deals with female revenge and getting back at the people who have attacked them. But where Last Night in Soho veers off in a different direction is when they decide to make Sandy a potential serial killer. She's no longer just acting in self-defense or anger or pain. She is perfectly willing to kill Eloise and Eloise's friend John just to keep her secret. I didn't like this aspect. I thought that the reveal of Miss Collins, played magnificently by the late Diana Rigg, by the way, and the reveal that she was Sandy, I thought this was reveal enough, this was twist enough, even to the point where it's revealed that she killed Jack. I can get on board with that. But everything, after that just failed for me. I thought they did a good job initially showing how she gradually lost herself under the pain of being trapped in this situation that she's in. So I don't understand how they did such a poor job of depicting her later trauma and how she dealt with it. It's revealed that the spirits of the men who assaulted Sandy and who she killed are the ones who pulled Eloise back into the past, not Sandy. And while what Sandy did is bad, it's wrong, I didn't like that the real villains of the piece, the men who assaulted her, became the victims, and suddenly the victim of this story becomes the film's villain. I felt as though the second half of the film was definitely not as strong as the first half. The first half for me is 5 out of 5. It is just almost a perfect movie. The second half began to drag a little bit, and as Eloise was spiraling into the darker side of these memories of the past, the scenes became a little repetitive. I think there was just a lot of scenes where Eloise is just running through the streets of Soho looking scared and worried. I thought Eloise's friend John had some reactions to events and dialogue that were a little odd or a little unbelievable. Is that the word I'm looking for? Just some of the things that he witnesses are a little bit out there, and I think that maybe in reality people would react a little bit more strongly than he does. And I think that some of the things he says to her are a little bit strange. When they're in the library and Eloise is trying to find articles in the newspaper of a missing girl, John comes up to her and he says that he's willing to help her because his aunt believes loads of crazy beep. So it's like, okay, so my aunt believes loads of crazy beep, so I'm used to women believing in crazy stuff. And I don't know, the help that he offers her is maybe not the type of help that somebody in that situation would really need. And it's probably unfortunate for the character of John and the guy who plays him that he is performing against some really strong portrayals from Diana Rigg, from Thomasin McKenzie, from Anya Taylor-Joy, from Matt Smith. So yeah, for me, he just wasn't the strongest character, but I think the poor guy he wasn't helped by being a supporting cast to such a strong leading cast. So by the end of the film, it's revealed that both John and Eloise survived the incident, and Eloise's doe-eyed, rose-tinted glasses have definitely gone. And while she still is true to herself and she still loves the 60s and is inspired by them and by Sandy, instead she has a more realistic and mature view of it, and she has grown through her experiences throughout the movie. So my overall thoughts are that despite some of the choices in the ending that I didn't really like, I did really love this film. I think that the actors gave incredible performances, and I think that the soundtrack and the Café de Paris scene are things that dreams are made of. And I found Eloise's initial escapes back into the past absolutely intoxicating. They are just so visually beautiful and full of energy. But I also loved how, as the film progresses, along with Eloise, the audience experiences the colder reality and sees the darker underbelly of Soho in the 1960s. So that is Last Night in Soho. I would love to know your guys' thoughts on the film, but in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by and listening to this horror fan's thoughts and opinions. I appreciate each and every one of you. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye guys. Not only was she in the TV series The Avengers as Mrs. Peel, no, not Mrs. Peel. Who was she? She wasn't Mrs. Peel. That was John Peel. She was... Oh God, what was her name? She wasn't Mrs. Peel. John Peel and Mrs. Oh no, she was Mrs. Peel. Emma Peel. John Steed.